Okay, so with me, I have my wonderful colleagues and friends. I feel very privileged that I get to work with you and collaborate with you. Thanks for joining me today. Um, and what we'll do is I'll just invite them first to say a few words, and I'll start with Sean Bayne and Jen Ross. They're both professors here at our research center. So you both, Sean and Jen, you both research digital education futures. And I thought if you could say a few words about this research, what is it? For someone who's not familiar with your work. Um, why do you think it matters, and what do you want to achieve with it? And overall, how do you think your research is presented in your teaching and in our program?
Thank you so much, Janja. And hi, everyone. It's really great to be here. My name is Jen Ross, and I'm going to kick off with some thoughts about those questions that Janja has asked. So I think my colleagues and probably lots of other people in the room right now would probably agree that those of us who are working in the field of digital education as teachers, as learning technologists, as researchers, we encounter a lot of promises and predictions about what technology is going to do for, or maybe to, education in various kinds of ways and various kinds of technological forms. Um, so this is one way that the kind of future makes its way into digital education, but there are a lot of other ways to think about and work with futures, and it's actually really useful and important to try to engage with these in our field. Otherwise, we really can get quite stuck with unsatisfying and actually sometimes really damaging and harmful policies and practices that are really aimed at preparing us for a future that we might not even want or might not be beneficial. So, my own work has been focused on how to use speculative methods to do futures work. And I use those methods, which are about trying to kind of use the uncertainty of the future creatively in the present. I use them to work on all kinds of issues in digital education, like surveillance and automation, online and hybrid teaching, and infrastructure, and try to use them to explore what different futures might be possible and what difference it might make to have those different ideas of the future now. And those ideas are all reflected in the course that I teach on the MSc in digital education, which is called Futures. So on that course, we explore futures thinking, so like what it means to actually think about the future, futures methods, and that includes speculative methods like the ones I've just talked about. And we apply those methods and ways of thinking to analyzing emerging technologies and ideas, not only in the field of education, but in other sectors as well. Yeah, so that's a little bit about me and what I've been up to. Um,
Thanks,
and
Jen.
yeah, thanks, Jan.
Sorry.
Yeah, please.
No, it's really great to hear you sort of summarize your work in that way, because obviously I know you work and we work alongside each other, but it's always really fascinating to hear colleagues summarize what they do.
Mm,
Thanks for that. And I'm wondering what kind of how could you say a bit more about kind of how this work is going to connect to the course that you're teaching, and in particular, maybe what kind of work are you expecting that students will do on this course that will connect with this research agenda that you've established?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Shan. So on the course, as you might imagine, the themes actually, like the specific themes that we look at, change quite often. So in recent years, students who have taken the Futures course have tackled a whole range of topics, including themes of trust, sustainability and privacy, interfaces, representation, and failure. I liked that one. And lots more as well. And so they read about different ways of considering the future of education, not only through educational literature, but other kinds of literature as well, and how futuring methods can help support critical engagement with these kinds of topics. And then they build their expertise in a topic that they choose, aligned with one of those themes through two assignments that are linked together. So the first one is a position paper assignment where they try to really propose a future or warn against a future. And the second thing is to transform that position paper topic like into an open educational resource, so something that will be on and live on the web after the end of the course. And so, yeah, it's been really great to see the kinds of work that students have done, and maybe we'll come back and talk about more about that later on. But Sian, I'd really like to hear from you about the kinds of work that you're doing and how you see it connecting to the MSc Digital Education program and also to the theme of education futures.
Yeah, thanks, Jen, and also thanks, Janja, for organising this event, because I think it's always been so important that the MSc programme sort of, it always has been really built on the research that we do, and similarly the research that we do really builds on the teaching. So I think what we do is quite unique, really, in terms of that really tight connection between teaching and research, and something I'm really proud of. In terms of my own work, so I've been thinking quite a long time now, really, about ways in which we make it possible for colleagues working in education, whatever sector, to kind of build a collective idea of a preferable future, because education is a really complex sector, loads of different stakeholders, loads of different tensions and different visions of what education should be. So how do we work collectively to understand what our preferable future might be so that we can work towards building it, right? So I know this connects quite tightly with your work as well, Jen. But for me, most recently, I've been working with the idea of utopia as a way of imagining and building futures. So sometimes when I talk about utopia, people say, well, that's just silly, that's just kind of that's dreaming, that's kind of fanciful nonsense. But actually what I mean in this sense is a kind of rigorous utopia, the sense of how we use the scholarship of utopia to engage in intellectual activity which enables radical disruption and critique. So how can we, in universities or in schools or whatever sector we're working in, support society to collectively imagine and then demand better futures? So it's kind of it's positioning education within its broader political context as well. I'm also working on artificial intelligence futures as well. So at the moment, I'm doing a project with a colleague Javier Tejero, which is called AI for Teaching Innovation. And this project is utopian in the sense that it's trying to build a model of ground up AI in which we support individual academics, individual teachers to design and build AI apps directly for use in their classes. So it's the kind of counter to the enterprise top-down extractive models of AI use to kind of really build a model of the future in which individuals feel a sense of agency over AI and tech generally. And this is what we're keen to build into the new master's course on assessment.
That is really completely fascinating. And for those who don't know Sian's work, I think it's really been marked, at least in my experience of the work that you do, by this really amazing interplay of, asking really critical, really theoretically informed questions, but then trying to actually build stuff to try to explore them and answer them. And I think actually lots of us have been inspired by that in the work that we do as well. So it's really amazing to hear about that. And I'd also really like to hear more about the way you're connecting that futures work, perhaps particularly the AI related work, to your work around assessment on the MSc Digital Education. So maybe you can tell us more about what that new course might look like.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. It's always exciting to think about creating a new course. So the Masters in Digital Education has always had a course on assessment, but we're kind of looking at how do we shift that now, because obviously the landscape of assessment in education is really shifting quite a lot in response to AI and other data-driven technologies, and it's creating some big challenges for us as educators. So when this course launches, it may not be for a year or two, we'll be looking at, well, firstly, assessment in context, so the histories and cultures of assessment, and why do we assess, what are the current dominant assessment modes, closed book exams and standardized assessments, and how those become mainstream, how have those been the ways that we commonly think about assessment, and what are the alternatives, and what are the global politics of assessment in that sense. But it's also, our program is always kind of focusing on enabling students to do hands-on creative stuff as well. So part of this course is also going to be about imagining alternative ways to think about assessment and discussing different ways of doing it, maybe radical approaches like peer assessment, no assessment, collaborative assessment, and so on. And then we will also, of course, be thinking about contemporary challenges to assessment. So particularly those posed by artificial intelligence and data-driven technologies, but looking at kind of automated assessment through the mining of personal data and impact of generative AI on integrity, plagiarism detection systems, all those kinds of things that are really contentious in education at the moment. So I'm really excited about this course.
It sounds really brilliant. And I think, yeah, this topic of assessment just keeps getting more and more interesting, doesn't it? So
Yeah.
yes, that's really great. Thank you, Sian. Janja, I think that's us. Back over to you.
That's so good. Thank you both so much for this wonderful contribution. And I was making notes like mad here because you said so many important things. But what I really love in what I'm hearing is, that you go beyond this sort of binary discussion. Technology is good or bad, or AI is here either to destroy education or to completely, like transform it in a positive way, but that you go beyond that and that you recognize the nuances and complexities of technology and sort of also work with this kind of local micro versus macro things happening to education, but like almost like produce and construct kind of resistance movement in a sense. I'm not sure, counter movement, let's put it this way, that's locally relevant, that's positive, that's of immediate use and quality and so on. So I really like what I'm hearing here, and I think that's a pretty good also. Would it be fair to say, colleagues on this call, that this is pretty much descriptive of the program in general? I think other course organizers are doing that as well, and as well as in our research. Jen, if we'll have time later, I would like to circle back to you as well, because you mentioned speculative methods. So I think it would also be quite helpful if you would perhaps elaborate a little bit on that, like what they are, just more concretely, so that people who haven't heard about that or used that get a sense of what they can do, how it works, just in a few sentences. And Sian, if we'll have time for you, I think this it would be good also to develop a little bit more in this sort of collective idea that you were talking about, collective work and how we can engage this relational work in our collectivity. And what is a collective, in a sense, especially because you have so many different actors involved with different aims and strategies. So how do you form a collective? Like, A, how do you define it? B, how do you form it? I don't know, it's big questions. So let's circle back if we can. But I'll move on to Michael and Rovincer now. Michael and Rovincer are fantastic researchers and colleagues and teachers at the center. And you both research digital technology and education in the majority world, and especially in the context of displaced people. Now, could you say a few words about this research? I think it might also be helpful if you just say a few words. What is the majority world? I'm not sure that everyone knows that. But like your research, what is it? Why it matters? What do you want to achieve with it? And how is it connected to your teaching?
Sure. Yeah, we can talk about that a little bit. So what is meant by the majority world? It comes from a phrase coined by Alum. The author's name is ALUM 2008. And it was an attempt, it incorporates the global South. So it is predominantly the global South, but it also incorporates minorities within minorities, essentially. So minorities within minority world positions, i.e. minorities within the UK, or minorities within Europe, or outside these central kind of centers of power. So it's meant to be a slightly more inclusive phrasing than strictly the global South would be. Although there are alternatives to the global South. You see some people talking about the global Souths, the multiplicity of the South in that, which basically does the same thing. But it was ultimately kind of a power play to suggest that the majority of the world's digital education is taking place outside places that we see predominate the literature, right? So the UK, the US, etc. It's taking place outside of that. that's essentially what the majority world is. But the reason Rovincer and I sort of focus on the work that we do, I think we've both been working in this space unbeknownst to each other. We've been working in this space for the last 20 years. I think what you might call digital education, or in some cases you might call digital development. It used to be called ICT for development, ICT for D, things like that. It's gone by many different names over the years. And then Rovincer and I became aware of each other through a project that we worked on meeting in 2019, specifically targeting digital education in the majority world context. And then we started focusing on the most marginalized populations that we could find, and that was refugee populations. So in many cases, it's a desire to abet or mitigate that situation, even though it's almost doubled in the 6 years that we've been working on this issue, the total amount of refugees worldwide, and it's a number that's set to exponentially increase in the coming years. So it is a future-focused issue, the idea of displacement. And another reason was that if we can make digital education work with these communities, it can work for everybody in a slightly more holistic kind of caring way. So Rovincer and I have been working on this issue. I think we're on our 4th consecutive project. We've been stringing together. Each project has a different name. Each project has ostensibly a different purpose, at least as listed in the funding call, but each project is doing the same thing, which is trying to get more refugees into higher education and to try to push back against some of the narratives I think we're all doing at the center around digital inclusion. I think Heeks at Manchester calls it adverse digital incorporation. So pushing back against the idea that just getting refugees online is the way to go. We push back against that quite routinely. Now, to get to that point, we've gone through a lot of work. Rovincer and our colleagues at Makerere, I should mention that Rovincer and I were collaborating before she came to Edinburgh. This was when she was at Makerere. And then we've been doing a lot of work on talking to, which we thought was the beginning part of all of our research methods and all of our teaching methods as it pertains to this, was moving against the narrative of these are voiceless people. So I think, and maybe Rovincer, you jump in here, this is like about capturing their aspirations in relation to digital education. Is that right?
That's very all right, Michael. When you talk about 2019 and what has just happened today, that we have just had in the meeting today, all just resonate together. And because today we have been involved in the process of co-creating with our teams that are based in Uganda and that are also based near one of the refugee camps, and that is one of the biggest refugee camps in the country, that is the Rhino camp. And in that area, it is kind of a hub for refugees that come from very many countries across the sub-Saharan region. And of course, some of them come from Eritrea and Ethiopia, so it's quite an expanse. Of course, cautious that Global South, our majority world, does not necessarily mean Uganda or does not mean only Sub-Saharan Africa. But in this space and within this dictated question and the Global South, we are trying, first of all, to understand the realities and the kinds of global challenges that need to be addressed with or without the technologies. And therefore, we very much center our work within both the local, regional, and international discourses. For example, the Sustainable Development Goals that we need to see aligned and being used as a kind of lens to address the kinds of challenges that are within the regions and the sectors, and of course linking back that to when you improve the kinds of resources, services in terms of education for refugee learners, in effect you are also improving the kinds of access, participation, and quality of education for the rest of the populations. And therefore, building on with this kind of regional, global impetus, trying to achieve and work towards refugee-connected education, trying to work towards achieving the 15 by 30 goal of achieving access and participation for refugee learners, we focus towards that digital education development, but in a way that does not look for best buys, that does not look, that is not against contextlessness, that is also looking into the futures. What kinds of aspirational futures do communities have, do students have, do sectors have? And therefore, we kind of take on context analysis briefs in many of our engagements with either partners, be it national technical working groups of ministries, be it students, be it higher education institutions. We want to understand from their own perspective, what are the issues? Can they be addressed with technology or without technology? Which actors do we want to work with? Which actors might lead us there? So in this way, we are able to engage in kinds of co-creational processes. And I find this quite really energizing on the program, because then when we have our programs, for example, the foundational course that I and Michael have been teaching on, we engage in these kinds of discussions about what is it within our regions, what is it within our institutions that we might want either to improve or to address or to use the technologies to be able to achieve the kinds of future that we want to envisage. And in the process, we co-create and produce several kinds of work and discussions that inform the work that we do on the program.
Yeah. Yeah, well done, Rovincer. Yeah, so to complement the stuff that, the methods, I should say, that Rovincer was talking about, so co-creation, participatory methods, all things focus more on the micro level. What are the aspirations of these refugee learners towards digital technology? So we walk in to these contexts not thinking that these teachers or refugee students will have aspirations necessarily towards digital technologies, and we have to be okay with that. So part of this is legitimizing the non-use of digital technologies to make that a legitimate choice. And so to do that means sort of counteracting some of the discursive kind of narratives we're seeing, right? The idea of digital divides, the idea of digital transformations, or being left behind by the thought of not participating in this digital economy where so much of the citizenship is sort of being laid out in front of them. So we think doing the micro methods is important, talking directly to people, workshops, participatory methods, co-creation. And the macro work is really critical as well. So that's more of the policy analysis, it's more political economy work, network analysis, trying to understand what futures are even possible by these networks that are surrounding these refugee contexts. And that macro work is really critical for the spaces that we work in, considering we're coming up on the end of the SDGs, right? So the SDGs run out not run out, they sort of expire in 2030. And the political and funding landscape that begat them in the first place all those years ago does not exist anymore. It's a radically different world so what is the future being taken forward there? Alongside this kind of increase in the number of displaced people, we also have this ambiguity in terms of what futures are we looking at. So we think the methods have to be both. They have to be a little bit of macro and they have to be micro. And I think a good researcher in this space needs to be versatile enough to do both. And I think Rovincer's right. A lot of that stuff does make its way into the program. So assessments. So I have an assessment on one of my courses that's about, doing crafting some sort of contextual analysis, as Rovincer was talking about, followed by a bit of advocacy. So an advocacy platform to sort of argue for the future that you would sort of hope to see realized in that context. So we sort of feel that it runs the gamut between the critique all the way to the creative and all the way into the advocacy expressions. So we try to reflect that a little bit in the courses as well. And we hope to do that for many more refugee countries, right, Rovincer? I think we're looking to do that with more.
Yes. And then we continuously engage with partners that are really active within the global South. And more especially, because we would like to reimagine and re-envision digital education in terms of connected education. And therefore, we would want to think beyond the tools to think about the embeddedness of our program in the institutions, with the learners, and with the sectors from where our students come from. And therefore, we work with connected education or connected learning as a kind of guiding philosophy to allow us think beyond the tools to the kinds of the social materiality of the program, and in terms of the kinds of contexts from which our learners come from, and want really to have an experience of the program, make sense of the kinds of possible solutions, possible agendas that can be achievable within either the organizations or institutions or within their sectors. For example, that much of the work has been funded in these global institutions has been funded by probably external support, and it is going down. So we are seeing technical working groups from national governments want to do dictate education to understand then what kinds of strategies we need to make, what kinds of policies do we make, how do we review our dictate education programs, how do we review our dictate education strategies within either institutions or within line ministries. And therefore, these are kinds of digital education reconceptualizations that you do not see are directly reflected to the tool, but are looking towards addressing the envisioning requirements for the kinds of participants that we have on that program.
That's great. Thanks, Rovincer. I think back to you, Janja.
Yeah, great. Thank you both again for really excellent contribution. And I think you really hit the nail here, Rovincer, you know, with just showcasing this sort of the balance between the micro imaginaries and all these discourses and then the actual local contextual needs, right? And technology not being the kind of the end in itself, but also your point about just like the pressure that different actors are in. Like if you're a state minister, or, you know, if you're a teacher or a school or university leader, you feel an enormous pressure. You need to do something, right? And especially you need to do something with the digital technology. So, you know, both of your points in terms of like what that means actually in that context, and how can you go about kind of resisting that but doing things well is really important. And I think both of your work as researchers, but also as tutors on the program, is really impactful in that way. So thanks very much. We'll move to Ben Williamson. Ben, your research is on educational future making, so a lot of what was discussed here already, and data infrastructures as well as financial practices in educational technology. You were also focusing a little bit on mobilization of bioscience in education and technology. So could you tell us a few words about your research? And I'd be quite curious to hear more specifically about your views and insights on AI specifically and datafication in education. And if you want to maybe also say a few words how that trickles down to the program.
Sure. Yeah, thank you, Janja. And it's lovely to hear from other colleagues as well. I suppose over about the last 10 years, I've thought of my research as following a thread that's a bit windy, but a thread that I've been calling digital education governance since I edited a special issue on that name about 10 years ago. So by this term, what I've been trying to get at is the ways in which digital technologies, you know, which are socially produced and so on, but have their own kind of constraints, limitations, affordances, and so on, and how digital technologies then end up being involved in shaping or steering, or in other words, governing educational institutions or educational practices, or governing what teachers can do, or governing what learners are able to do. And I suppose more specifically, what I've been really interested in is the ways in which data-based technologies and automated technologies like artificial intelligence of its various kinds are increasingly also involved in educational governance, all the way from OECD PISA data being involved in the way that education policymakers reshape kind of education policies and systems and so on, to the way in which something like generative AI today might be seen to, in some respects, be governing students' writing, or even in some ways, governing thinking itself. So all of the work has really been about trying to get to grips with how digital platforms for learning, or the data infrastructures that underpin the flow of data around education systems, and emerging technologies like analytics and artificial intelligence are involved in some ways in sort of steering, shaping, governing education in different ways. I suppose it's just two kind of concrete examples I'd like to give very, very briefly. One is our recent work on the kind of the extension of datafication to the biological body of the student. So going far past the idea of kind of observing students and datafying them through learning analytics or clicks on screens and so on, to actually capturing biodata from the biologically embodied student. So we've had a project about sort of data intensive biology. We've been looking at the ways in which genomic and neuroscience approaches are using various forms of data analysis technologies to, as it were, mine the body for data. And then the ways in which that's been leading towards kind of new understandings of the kind of the biological substrates of educational outcomes or learning processes and so on. So it's things like, using genomic scanning technologies to read DNA for clues about one's future educational outcomes, or using brain scanning neurotechnologies to do classroom-based neuroscience studies, all of which is leading to quite different ways of understanding what we think of as learning as something which can only be understood and made visible through this kind of datafication of biological substances and fibers and connections and networks and so on. Completely changes what I think we understand a student to be. So that's been a super interesting sort of extension on this work on datafication and digital education governance, because how do we govern and intervene on students when we understand them at a biological level? And then just very briefly, the other work that I've been involved in part with you, Janja, is around kind of finance actors, particularly looking at, for example, venture capital investors in the ed tech industry, and particularly the way they fund products that tend to capture an awful lot of data, because data are seen as valuable, because the data can be used to, for example, generate new products or upgrades for which new licenses can be sold to institutions and so on. So that's sort of datafication there, entangled with questions of economic value. Yet another kind of dimension of datafication, and also another dimension of governance, because once we have kind of finance actors who are funding these kind of technologies into being, then those technologies become part of the kind of fabric of our institutions. They interweave with educational practices and with the ways in which students undertake study and learning itself, sort of governing those processes as well. So I suppose those are the things I've been trying to do in terms of how some of that connects with teaching. I mean, broadly, my aim has been to try to bring a kind of critical data platform and infrastructure studies approach to some of the teaching that we do on digital education. So it informs parts of the sort of critical data and education course, as well as being embedded in certain aspects of the sort of the foundations course that we run as well.
Great, thank you so much, Ben. This is fascinating. I made lots of notes again, as with all of you, such great points. But I was particularly highlighting in my notes this idea around datafication making things tangible and visible, you know. So how does this sort of datafication as a process intervene and change, as you say, governing and subjectivities and learning and teaching just by highlighting specific things and not other things that are harder to grasp through data, and just what kind of impact that has. And also, at the very start, you mentioned, you know, digital technology being socially produced. That's also very, um, you know, with us, it might seem in the researchers' world, it might seem self-evident now, you know, that when we're talking about socio-technical imaginaries, we're talking about the social kind of production of technologies. But I'm not sure this is sort of more broadly and widely actually recognized and discussed. What does that actually mean? And what's the sort of political, economic, cultural nature of that social production of technologies and these processes? So thanks very much for bringing it. Sorry, Ben, did you want to respond?
Just going to say, yeah, I think through probably the work of most of us, an orientation to technology that sees it as socially produced,
Yeah,
but also socially enacted, the ways in which, you know, policymakers or educators interpret, respond to, work with particular technologies, tends to end up also sort of, in a sense, reshaping the technology, reshaping it through use. So that kind of the social and the socio-technical dimension, I think, flows through much of our research and much of our teaching as well.
yeah, definitely. Thank you for raising that. So I did post in the chat already. I invited people, if anybody has any thoughts or questions or comments they would like to share with the rest, please feel free to raise your hands or type in the chat. In the meantime, we'll continue, but I'll also like to give the opportunity to my colleagues to respond to each other. If you wanted to share anything about what was said already. Jen, you are nodding.
I was only because something that Rovincer said made me curious to know more. And it was when you were talking, Rovincer, about sort of the process of trying to understand realities, rather than, you know, like the way I interpreted this was from what Michael was saying as well, is like rather than swooping in and trying to like give solutions, the time that it takes to actually understand realities. This feels like a gap in a lot of digital education research. It seems like a lot of research in our field is about like evaluating interventions without necessarily taking that time to see like what is happening and try to understand what forms of education are actually meaningful in a given place. And I was wondering, like, do you think that's true? And also, what sorts of unintended consequences does it have when you kind of dive right into solutions without trying to really understand the the landscape? That could really be for either of you, but it was just something that Rovincer said that made me think about it.
Yeah, thank you so much. I could respond, and afterwards, I think, Michael, you would do. For example, in today's meeting, one of our teams working on AI and refugee teachers training had gone to do training in a secondary school, and then was asked by some of the teams there whether to include all the teachers and not only train the refugee teachers.
Mm.
So then we then advised the team, and this is a broader team working with ministry and many other people. So then we started now on the guidance. Okay, where did you start from? We start from an understanding of the requirements of the sector, the aspirations of the participants in the sector. What are the requirements of the Ministry of Education in terms of any kind of professional teacher training, especially in terms of digital education? Who should it exclude and who should it include? And this once again also links to our research that we undertake intersectional research, such that we are able to be able to identify the kinds of identities, the kinds of requirements for each and every identity, and the kinds of needs and aspirations that we want to address. So at a macro level, we usually do a kind of horizon scanning, and this is why I and Michael have taken all these years doing the similar kinds of studies, because it takes time to kind of understand requirements for institutions, aspirations of individual teachers or participants, and aspirations of national government. But at the same time, linking this back to the sustainable development goals, trying to understand from the point of the local and regional, but at the same time trying to understand within the broader agenda of the international actors, what do we need to come together to do? And this again also links to the kind of call that we I think yet to have in terms of connected learning. Where do we want to go? How do we connect everyone? How do we connect our ideas? And then against contextlessness, which I think our colleague William also writes much about. Yeah, over to you, Michael.
Yeah, I'll keep it real short, Jen. But just to build on what Rovincer said, it was like, number one, I think the specter of past failures looms large here. So your one laptop per child, your MOOCs, your any of these large scale ICT initiatives that have more or less kind of or Bridge International Academies, any of these that have sort of they loom large in the consciousness about what's possible and what's required and what happens when potentially well-meaning tech actors come in and just dump a lot of tech on a very unstable environment. And I think there's a little bit of that, and then there's a little bit of the ethical responsibility of knowing in many of these contexts we work with refugees, and not in many cases, not Uganda specifically, but in many cases they don't have legal rights to education, or they don't have legal rights to employment, or in many cases they don't have a legal right to get a SIM card to activate their mobile phone. So they use a local citizen to buy them a SIM card, but it shows up under the local citizen's name, so they're invisible. So understanding that kind of legal dimensions to the political climate, all of these things is incredibly critical, because you cannot separate education from those other spaces in these contexts. It's a broader area of politics and economics and all of these different things. So it's just rather irresponsible to run in there. It doesn't stop tech actors from doing it, but it's just rather irresponsible to run in there with like this tech solutionism.
We have a connected question here in the chat. You partly, I think, responded already with your interventions just now, but if you can maybe also have a short reflection, Rovincer and Michael. So the question is, how can we realistically imagine the digital education futures in communities where even basic digital education tools are still unfamiliar? As global discussions focus on AI in education, how do we ensure that under-resourced contexts are not left behind and are meaningfully included in shaping these futures?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think it goes back. Yeah, it does go back a little bit to what we were talking about before. It was the idea that, number one, you got to throw away the idea of being left behind as a discourse, right? So this idea of having and have not, the digital and the not, we're legitimizing all of that. These are just futures, right? So we can call them education futures, but we can be more specific and call them digital education futures. Doesn't seem very logical to do that. These are education futures. And I think working with those communities and co-designing and co-developing, like Rovincer was talking about, is the only way forward. And doing so with whatever's available to you. Paper and pens and mobile phones and radio and TV, whatever's available, that's what you would use.
Yeah, just to add
that. Yeah, let's go ahead, Rovincer.
When I contacted Michael, our first contact was, I was sharing a paper that we had written out of minimal computing using mobile phones to provide mentoring support to teachers, because we wanted to reach to teachers across a geographical expanse, but teachers who do not have a computer or any access to a kind of advanced device. So they were using feature phones, mobile phones. And we used the kinds of, we started by trying to understand what kinds of devices then do they use? What kinds of access software do they use then? What kinds of application do they use? If they are using this application, then we meet them where they are.
Yeah, that's good.
Great, thank you. Jen, you wanted to intervene?
No, those two said it better.
Okay, but I do want to ask about this follow-up question, actually, the global discussion about AI, right? So, and Ben, I invite you to come in here, and then if anybody else wants to comment as well. But it just feels, personally, I just feel like there's a lot of pressure happening here and really forced sort of implementation of AI, especially LLMs, large language models, and these ideas about, you know, these sort of personalized tutors and agents in schools at all stakes. So, you know, I've talked to some people who are quite cynical about this and would say if this is not more about securing a return on investment for how much it costs to develop these systems, things like OpenAI, more than the actual quality of education, or, you know, this sort of, just because in some parts of the world and in some, and not even consistently across one country, right, because schools and different regions even within one country have very different situations in terms of resources and imaginaries and all of that. But like, just because somebody can afford to pay subscriptions to large language models, does that mean that they are now at the forefront of actual quality education? Or, you know, what, how can we think about AI in education in this broad sense? Ben, big question for you. What are your thoughts?
Well, thank you, Janja. Yeah, that's a big one. I mean, a lot of my work, more in fact, my kind of attempt to intervene on social media is about trying to bust some of the hype and just sort of puncture some of the outrageous expectations and just silly claims that are made about the transformative and revolutionary potential of AI, and sometimes just to draw attention to a kind of long history of social scientific studies that have repeatedly demonstrated that these kinds of revolutionary and transformative claims are never realized. And there's really nothing to indicate that AI will be the same. That a lot of claims about, you know, how transformative AI is going to be for education rests on absolutely zero credible evidence, despite the fact that you have all of these kind of evidence or claims that things are transforming rapidly, which are really circulating. So partly, I think there's some important work to do about sort of deconstructing these kinds of claims and also deconstructing the kinds of futures that are assumed in those claims, which I think is important work to do. I mean, you know, we can sort of do it on social media a little bit, but there's the more important work, I think, of actually really studying what happens when AI gets into or is applied in particular contexts. And that doesn't just mean in classrooms, it can mean when it gets applied in policy programs. So my own little bit of actual research I'm doing around AI, in addition to the kind of social media meltdowns, is to try and follow the way in which the Department for Education in England is trying to enact generative AI in things like teacher marking and teacher lesson planning. There is a very specific way in which the Department for Education is interpreting and acting on AI as a way of attempting to sort of solve some policy problems, as a way of attempting to placate teachers and their unions, as a way of trying to turn a very, very political and social policy problem, that of teacher overwork, into a technical problem that can then be solved with AI. I think it's getting really kind of up close to some of the action. How are these technologies then being applied in certain ways, interpreted and then applied in certain ways that really demands our attention in relation to something like AI? It's too big otherwise. There's too much of it going on. But Sian's approach to it, of course, is much more in terms of innovation and creativity and co-production through the involvement of actual educators, which I think is the other sort of really important aspect of the research we can do in this space.
Yeah.
I don't know if I can come in there, Janja.
Yeah, go on.
Because I think what you just said, Ben, connects to one of the questions that's just come through in the chat from Raphael, who says that we're seeing a lot of the key research on AI now being done by big companies rather than universities. And also we're seeing a lot of education now being done by companies in training contexts, particularly by MOOC companies rather than universities. So Raphael's asking, what do we see the future of universities as being? I think that's a really good question. I think it connects with what you've just said. It's just that I think in universities, despite the fact that the sector is under a lot of pressure in various ways, we do have a space here in which to do things differently, to experiment with things like bottom-up AI, for example, to work with our students to sort of collectively develop new ways of thinking about this world that we're currently in, which is so kind of besieged by crisis. So, we don't yet answer to stakeholders, we don't directly answer to governments, we answer to our students and to our own academic body and to the communities in which we're based. So that does mean that we are quite different organisations, very different institutions from the big companies. Some of them, doing amazing research on AI. So I think that's the value of being at university, since this is partly about the value of our programme and our masters and value of studying at universities. I think that's why universities are still, despite everything, a space aside where different kinds of thinking and different kinds of working together can happen. That's my view anyway. I'm sure colleagues will have other things that they would like to add to that, but thanks.
I agree 100%, Sean. And I think this is perhaps a good time to start concluding this, because you just gave a good, such a good, I think, is it silver lining? But sharing thoughts are like, what is, and that's not a very good phrase to use, but like the added value of the university, right? So why would somebody still decide to go to the university rather than take an AI generated course in one of the sort of MOOC providers and so on? And what why does it matter? And I think this is just such an important point, that universities and stakeholders of the university and us as constituents don't necessarily talk about as much as we should. It's all about sort of almost like a defensive mode against what's happening, just because it all feels so overwhelming, instead of actually taking a step back and critically thinking what is it that the role of the university is and what we're doing here. So I really take your point, Sean, and would like to highlight that. And just to say that the program that I mentioned at the beginning, our program, Digital Education Masters, has been running for 20 years, as I said. It has been changing in time. And we have worked really hard in the past few years, and especially the last year, to give it a little bit of a new face. So we renamed the courses. We are updating the website. Please come and visit. But I would say that there are three things that have stayed consistent and are still relevant today. One is that we keep the program and all of its courses timely and relevant, in the sense that we respond to what's happening with technology and education and the context, but also relevant for everyone who comes to the course. So for all students, regardless of where they're in geographically or in which kind of job. So everyone can design their own way through the program, as well as pretty much determine quite a lot in terms of what they want to focus on in each of the courses. So the program is relevant in terms of what's happening with digital education, that we're always timely with new processes and technologies and discourses, but also relevant for each and every individual. Second, that it's very communal and community oriented. So we really cherish the diverse nature of our student and alumni body. So people really do collaborate a lot and learn from each other. Our students come from around the world, and they have really different experiences. They're all mid-career professionals. They might be teachers, learning technologists, education institutional leaders, policymakers, NGO workers, and so on. And everyone brings their own view, and this is just so valuable, We also like to bring in guests and alumni, so we really do, cherish this community aspect. And third, I think it's also about making interventions, right? So what we want is to create change towards better through our research and teaching. So we hope we're making change with the program by, teaching as well as students themselves. One, through assignments, as I think, Michael, you highlighted that people in courses actually create assignments that are quite applicable in their context, so they can directly make change in their context through assignments quite directly, but then also indirectly, through things they learn in their context and in their environments. And I think this is also connecting to how we started. Sian and Jen, you were talking about this, macro kind of dynamics and imaginaries versus the local initiatives and contextual needs. And that was, I feel, like a thread that went through all of our discussions and interventions. So I can speak for everyone that we're quite proud of the program and including these refresh changes. So thank you for joining us and giving us the opportunity to share our work and to talk about the program with you. And please feel free to visit our website and keep an eye out on the website as there's more to come. There's going to be videos and more information in the coming weeks and months. Thank you everyone so much for joining me.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Janja.